So we are now live. So again, this is being recorded and we are streaming to YouTube. So welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Ilan Kelman and I'm Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London and also affiliated with the University of Agder in Southern Norway. At University College London, I am 50% at the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and 50% at the UCL Institute for Global Health. So the idea is really to bring together topics of disasters and health. And to connect with me and to find out more about our work, I'm just going to send to the chat to everyone my social media contacts. So please do connect with me, join me, comment on this live, because part of the structure is going to be interaction to ensure that we can get your questions from you and your feedback from you. Also, apologies that there was a bit of an issue with the topic, that some of the advertisements said that we'll be talking about conflict and disasters today. The actual topic is what I hope most of you signed up for and are expecting, which is creating catastrophe, pandemics and beyond, or really why disasters are not natural. If you are interested in more about conflict and disasters, then some of the work which we're doing is certainly going to come forward or could come out in the questions. So I'm just sending the link to some of the work on conflict and disasters, which I do, which is called Disaster Diplomacy. And you can go to that website and see more. We also have others within the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction who do conflict and link it to humanitarian and disaster topics, such as Poonam Yadav and Jessica Field, both of whom will be doing similar sessions to this one later in the summer. And Poonam Yadav is also the co-director of the UCL IRDR Center for Gender and Disaster, which just shows that in addition to me connecting disasters and health, we bring in all these wider contexts, whether it's violence or conflict or humanitarianism, gender and disability, in order to really try and give a full spectrum of all of the vulnerabilities which end up over the long term causing disasters. A lot of which is going to really come forward during this session in terms of why this focus is on vulnerabilities and not necessarily hazards. And the structure of the next hour is going to be somewhat similar to how we are going to be approaching our education over the next year. So we are in a situation where we're not certain how much face-to-face contact is actually safe or feasible, or how much people are able to travel to London or even into the UCL campus when they are in London. But it means that we can use this sort of technology and the blended approach to ensure that nothing is sacrificed in the education. Since in addition to doing research on these topics of disaster diplomacy, of pandemics, of why disasters are not natural, we also do an extensive amount of teaching. And that occurs at all three higher education levels. So next September, we are very excited to start a Bachelor in Global Humanitarian Studies. And this means that we can give 3 years, 3 full years of different aspects of humanitarianism, different approaches to dealing with disasters, what humanitarianism means in different contexts. We also run several master's programs, and I can see in the attendance list that some of the people, some of the students who we are hoping will join us in September are here. And basically it means you become a master of disaster. So we run several programs, and please go to our website, look at the undergraduate and master's program, for which we're really aiming to ensure that you get the skills that you need to pursue the career that you want. Dealing with risk, dealing with humanitarianism, dealing with disasters. That might be in private industry, might be in the nonprofit sector, could be with government, or we will certainly encourage academia, because we also run a very vibrant PhD program. And we have about 24 PhD students, again, some of us who have kindly joined us, and the topics cover such a broad range. So it can be dealing with prolonged field care. How do you deal with medical emergencies in remote regions? Or looking at emergency management within the context of your particular country and how emergency operations centers are run. We also have PhD students looking at ice physics, and others looking at volunteerism, or different modes of how informal and formal approaches are used within dealing with disasters. So this is really how we meld our research with our education to ensure that in the classroom or on Zoom as the case may be, as well as our field trips or virtual field trips, you are learning from those who are researching these topics and applying them in reality through policy advice to government, consultancies who want to generate some aspects of practice, or also using our work in order to formulate training courses. Again, to remind you that throughout this webinar, it is being recorded, but I will not be mentioning your names, and your names are not going to come up in it. As we go forward, the approach which we're using then comes down to this blended way of looking at how we do things live and interactively as much as possible, but also using some pre-recorded material in order to help people, whether they're in different time zones or maybe want to watch it at their own leisure. So we are streaming to YouTube, and this will be available on YouTube after. But what it does mean is that following this brief introduction, I'm simply going to play a pre-recorded video of me giving about 15 minutes of the topic. Then we'll come back for the question and answer for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then go to a second video followed by another question and answer session. This may seem rather odd because I'm here talking to you and then going down and streaming a video. But the advantages are that, number one, there will be subtitles, and apologies for the typos in the subtitles, but I'm sure you'll be able to work those out. It also means that while this video is streaming, I'll be on another computer and monitoring my Twitter. So if you have questions, please tweet live and I may respond right to the question and answer. Please also use the question and answer session, which you see in Zoom, and also the chat function, which is there. And preferably put your question and answer and chats public so that I can see them in the other account. Otherwise, you will see that I have a second account listed there. And if you want to private message me during the videos, then it would be that second account, because this computer here will be streaming, so I can't actually see the messages. So otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to it. And I'm going to now share my screen and go to the first video. So please use the public chat, use a question and answer, tweet me with what you want to hear, and then I can come back and respond directly to you. So we now have here the first video, and this will take about 15 minutes. Hello, my name is Ilan Kelman. I am an academic staff member at University College London, 50% at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and 50% at the Institute for Global Health. The idea being to connect disasters and health. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is just my name, at Ilan Kelman, so at ILANKELMAN. So please feel free to join the discussion, to put news items, to talk about current events, and we can all come together to determine how can we deal with disasters and health together without causing more problems than we solve. So what I'm going to do in this session is simply talk about what is a disaster, to discuss some of the fundamentals. We can then have a bit of a discussion, after which I will apply these ideas of the fundamentals to the 2020 pandemic of COVID-19. And hopefully this will instill some of what we are trying to do with our science, but also ensure that we apply our science to society to be certain that we are helping people to influence policy and practice. And this goes right from the international level all the way down to the individual level, what families and households can do to deal with these situations and preferably avoid them. So it really starts with the question, well, a disaster, but what is a disaster? And there are books written about this topic. In fact, trawling through dictionaries and professional manuals and academic literature and some of the glossaries from international organizations such as United Nations, I really tried to bring it all together to distill it into really just 7 words. That a disaster is a situation requiring outside help for coping. Something happens, we cannot deal with it ourselves, so we need to ask someone else to assist us. This works at the individual level. This also works at the international level, and really everything in between. It is somewhat intuitive, So hopefully it can be translated across cultures and across languages, although there is some vagueness. For example, what does situation mean? What does coping mean? Even what does outside help mean? But when we're talking, when we're communicating, there's always the potential for ambiguity. There's always a potential for vagueness. That can't be avoided. What I hope works with this definition is that it is fairly straightforward, does not use a lot of words, and has an idea which we can all grasp, which we can all relate to. That may not be the case when we try to understand why this sort of situation arises. Why is there elements which come into the fact that something happens and we cannot cope with it? And this is where we start to break down what a disaster is. And we see that there are two main elements, two main components within it: hazard and vulnerability. Neither word is straightforward. They are not always easy to translate completely into other languages, but disaster risk comes from this combination of these ideas of hazards and vulnerabilities. So what is a hazard? If we're talking about the environment, if we're talking about nature, then it's sort of the usual phenomena, processes, events, which we are all aware of and which we see all the time, whether it's a windstorm or a cyclone, a hurricane, an earthquake, a landslide, a tsunami, a meteorite striking. Those are all perfectly typical, perfectly normal environmental events, which happen and sometimes cause problems and sometimes do not cause problems. Why they cause problems and how they cause problems is this other element within disaster risk, that of vulnerability. Vulnerability indicates why some people can deal with a flood, with volcanic eruption, and other people cannot. Vulnerability is a societal process which lets us live in certain ways, or forces us to live in certain ways, which includes livelihoods, locations, what we do day to day, what we do decade to decade. So it lets us live or forces us to live in certain ways that we cannot deal with the hazard. Therefore, we get harmed, there's damage, and often we require external assistance in order to deal with that harm or damage, in which case it becomes a disaster. Now, it's interesting that not everything within this is necessarily entirely connected to nature on the hazard side. So yes, absolutely, earthquakes are a natural process. It rains, we get flooding. But there's also a lot that we do to modify the hazard. So, for instance, we know that it is possible that we can influence earthquakes, such as through filling reservoirs, such as through explosions, such as through fracking. We also know that we frequently influence floods, engineering rivers, building walls along coasts or along the rivers. And that means that we are changing the characteristics of the flood. So if we constrict a river, if we deepen it, then it means that for the same rainfall, that flow will be faster and it is often higher also. This means that even when the hazard is coming from the environment, it is not necessarily entirely natural. There's a lot that we can do to actually modify the hazard to change what is happening in order to ensure that the full force, the full energies of that hazard do not necessarily hit us or our infrastructure. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If we look at weather seeding, if we look at cloud seeding, that has a lot of uncertainty and a lot of dispute about whether or not it works. Certainly there have been a few efforts to seed a hurricane, which may or may not have altered the hurricane's direction and strength. But when it was clear that what could potentially happen is liability, as in suing people for modifying that hurricane, a lot of these efforts stopped. So we have this peculiar interaction between hazard and vulnerability, the hazard sometimes coming from nature but often affected by humanity, the vulnerability entirely being a political process. They come together and create this disaster. They come together and create this situation which requires outside help for coping, which is fine in a dictionary, it's fine in a glossary, it's fine to discuss in a presentation or in the classroom. How do we apply that in practice? So let's consider something like an earthquake, and here's where it's a bit of a quiz. So I want you to think about human history and consider how many deaths in human history have been caused by earthquakes. The construction of that question is deliberate. I'm looking as the cause being earthquakes. This means that the answer is effectively zero. Zero human deaths throughout human history. Many recent and historical examples where an earthquake happens, infrastructure collapses, we see the rescuers pulling out live people as well. The cause of death was not the shaking. The cause of death was the infrastructure collapsing. And we know this because we have so many examples of similar earthquakes where some of them killed people, a lot of people, and some of them really didn't cause that many casualties. We know how to build infrastructure which can withstand the shaking. Sometimes we do, in some places we do. Sometimes we do not, in other places we do not. This is the difference between hazard and vulnerability. The hazard is an earthquake, perfectly natural process, which yes, we can influence to some extent, but earthquakes are happening anyway, compared to the vulnerability, which is being an infrastructure which collapses in shaking, and often not having the choices, not having the resources, not having the power to try and do anything about the infrastructure, so that you know you are in a building which as soon as there's shaking, it will collapse and you may be dead. Many of the examples that we have show very clear contrasts. 2003 was one such year. So there was a huge earthquake in northern Japan, absolutely immense and fairly shallow, so people really felt the shaking and there was a lot of potential damage. And there was some damage, except there were no widespread infrastructure collapses. In fact, no one was reported to have died from infrastructure collapsing. Instead, one person was reported to have been killed when they were sweeping up glass afterwards and were hit by a car. So an absolutely massive earthquake, but not really an earthquake disaster. Then just a few months later, same year, 2003, 22nd December 2003, in Central California, had a shallow, fairly moderate earthquake. It wasn't that bad, but people certainly felt the shaking. And the death toll was 2, because a clock tower collapsed and fell on them as they were exiting the building. The owner of that building was eventually found liable in a court case, demonstrating that the death toll could have been 0, but a human decision to not reinforce a building meant that 2 people were killed in the earthquake, or were killed, their cause of death was because of the building collapse, the clock tower collapse, not because of the earthquake shaking per se. So 2 examples of earthquakes, one big, one moderate, and not a lot of problems. Well, where's the comparator? The comparator came just 4 days after the Californian one, 26 December 2003, southern Iran, World Heritage City of Bam. An earthquake with very similar parameters to the one in California, fairly shallow and moderate. Death toll was over 25,000 people because the structures collapsed on the people as they were sleeping and killed them. Iran, California, and Japan have some of the best earthquake engineers in the world. They have some of the best earthquake scientists in the world. They know exactly what needs to be done. They know how to save lives in earthquakes. The issue is not having the skills or the knowledge. The issue is having the wisdom for the policymakers and decision makers to turn that into practice. In Japan and California, they have learned from past earthquakes, have done a lot of work, and to a large extent have many successes. This does not stop a major failure happening in the future, but what we know in 2003, the lessons were learned and applied and saved lives. In Iran, policy and decision-making was different. It was not applied in southern Iran, and so we had this absolutely horrendous earthquake disaster, even though the knowledge was there regarding earthquake hazards, earthquake vulnerabilities, and earthquake risks. So it shows we have the knowledge. We potentially have the power and resources if we choose to apply them. But sometimes we do, and sometimes we do not. So the disaster is really our choice, which shows that disasters are not really natural. They come from vulnerability, not the hazard. They come from us. They come from our decisions and choices. And the vulnerability takes a long time to build up. It took a long time for California and Japan to make themselves resistant to some seismic shaking. And it took a long time to build Bamaran to the extent that it had such awful and earthquake vulnerability. So disasters are not events. The hazard might be an event like an earthquake happening quickly, but the disaster is this long-term process, coming from this long-term process of vulnerability. So we say that disasters are not natural. We should not use the phrase natural disaster. And we say that disasters are not events, they are processes. And they always happen over a long time, over a generation, over decades. The hazard may happen quickly, but the disaster does not. And the disaster ultimately comes from our choices. So this means that it is really disaster by choice, which is a book which I wrote, published this year in February, describing these issues of hazards and vulnerability and pointing out how society makes choices to create disasters. And far too often, choices are made by one sector of society, often the minority with power, choices, and resources, for the majority, for all of us. Vulnerability is created for us, choices are taken for us, which means that the disaster is created for us, and we suffer because of it. So disaster by choice, yes, but not everyone has those choices. And that's what we need to work towards, to ensure that people do have the choices and that people make choices to avoid disaster by choice. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And it's great to see that we do have one question which has come in, so I can address that directly. And please, at the moment, I have no questions on Twitter, but do in the question and answers or in the chat provide questions for that. Academic staff member at University College London. So this is a very fundamental question, and actually a very helpful and useful question. It's asking that we've always used the formula risk is hazard, which is probability of an event times vulnerability times exposure. High hazard does not mean high risk, which is absolutely the point. It's not the earthquake per se or the flood per se, which leads to that high risk. And these variables are strictly linked. So an earthquake in the desert is the risk is zero. What do I think about that approach? And yes, this is fundamental. There are, as always, a number of provisos. So first is the challenge of differentiating between vulnerability and exposure. In the disasters field, no matter how often I've tried to drill down to really try and separate vulnerability and exposure, I really struggle to do it. So it's different in, say, environmental epidemiology, where vulnerability and exposure have slightly different definitions and it's much easier to differentiate it. But I just figure that it's hard enough to explain and translate words such as hazard and vulnerability. You then throw in another complication like exposure, and it just adds to the confusion. So I would say that rather than complicating, let's make things easier with two confusing words, hazard and vulnerability, rather than three confusing words, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Because if we think about it at the base level, both quantitatively and qualitatively, exposure actually unfolds very well into vulnerability. So just stick with certain words. So the second proviso is actually what you very cleverly imply in the question, that when you state these variables are strictly linked. So giving an equation like R equals H times E times V, or preferably R equals H times V, almost suggests independence of the variables. But we know they're not independent. We know they are inextricably linked. So we always have to maintain that understanding and that ethos that a hazard existing can affect vulnerability, but in fact, there is very little which is hazardous per se, unless there is vulnerability. So if we're thinking quantitatively, these are not orthogonal dimensions. They are not axes which are independent. They are actually linked. And sometimes we can indicate that by turning the strict multiplication into an integration. So therefore it becomes, say, risk is the integral from time 1 to time 2 of hazard and vulnerability, which are each a function of time, and then dt. So it's a question of they are actually linked through that parameterization, and we can actually calculate it that way. But there's also a flaw in this argument. At least it assumes that all these variables are calculable, are quantitative, and should be made calculable and quantitative. We need to challenge these assumptions. So as a mnemonic, risk being a combination of hazard and vulnerability is the simplest, easiest, and most straightforward way of doing it. As soon as we add an exposure, it adds unnecessary complications. As soon as we start working out, well, is it multiplication? Is it some sort of functionality, other functionalities and integral? Then it does work in some contexts, but we actually lose a lot of information through that. Some other excellent questions are coming through. Thank you so much. So why do some researchers use the term natural disasters? Well, ask them and tell them not to. It's something which we see frequently. Also, we have a hashtag, disasters are not natural, no natural disasters, as well as a website and a campaign, which is run by Kevin Blanchard, who I think is on this call. And it is so unfortunate that he does sometimes get fairly negative messaging and people who may disagree, which is fine, we need disagreement, but who are not actually willing to discuss. They're simply abusive or negative, which really has no place in science. Disagree, please. Tell us what you think, but let's do constructively and respectfully. And when you see the phrase natural disaster, just point out there's this 40, 50 years of science saying, try something else, don't use it, but also inquire, why do they use it? And perhaps what could be helpful in order for them to change their mind, to change their ideas. Next question we have here, very interesting discussion choices around policymaking regarding disasters, and the example between Japan and Iran is stark. I guess my question would be around where you have in developing countries huge numbers of people moving from rural to urban areas, and many end up living in very unsafe environments. People know that by choosing to live in these areas, they are at higher risk, but they lack social and financial capital to live, say, in less risky areas, and the government does not enforce rules around improved housing, for example. What can be done to address these issues? Well, number one, look to ourselves. Rural to urban migration does not happen in just the so-called developing countries. Living in unsafe environments does not happen in just these so-called poor or underdeveloped countries. And lacking the abilities, the choices, the resources, the opportunities happens everywhere. I can go walk out my door in London and see these happening. Take a look at many of the Indigenous communities in Northern Canada, a so-called developed, rich, affluent country. Many of these communities have worse infrastructure, worse services than the informal settlements in some of the megacities in the tropics. So number one, this division between developed and developing countries just does not work. It's old school. It's a continuum, and all places have more affluent and less affluent places. Number two, what do we do to address these issues? Talk to the people, talk to those involved, learn from our own backyard, and try to see why people may know the risk or may not know the risk, but still have no choice except to live in dilapidated infrastructure or in areas with hazards where they have no mechanisms to try and reduce their vulnerability. And number three, again, I'd be cautious about some of the jargon. Academia is very good at critiquing everything. Social capital, that phrase social capital, is one of the most intensely critiqued phrases which we see in this field. I just don't use it. It's not that I object to the concept, and there are some very powerful aspects, but just like exposure, it raises too many questions, causes too many problems. Let's talk about people as people, not as some sort of resource or wealth to be exploited, which is one implication of much social capital work. So yeah, what do we do to address it? Well, talk to the people, find out their situations, see what can and should be done better, what they can do for themselves and what they cannot do for themselves. As a disaster management academic or practitioner, how do I think we can influence a policymaker to consider incorporating these disaster aspects. It's a challenge, but we're certainly trying. And a lot of it comes from making you the policymaker. So our master's students and our PhD students are now in government, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector. One of our former master's students, it was actually part of this scientific advisory group on emergencies, which has obviously been highly involved in the current pandemic. And unfortunately, many of the politicians have completely ignored their advice. So simply by coming to do our degrees, by wanting to be in this field, by you wanting to be the policymaker, then you get to know us, you get to know our science, and we've hopefully influenced you constructively. The politicians may be another step, but as a policymaker, that's partly up to you. When we have people like my colleague, Professor David Alexander, testifying in front of some government committees, when we're able to get some of the UK Lords who sit in the House of Lords to speak at our conference, and we just had the MP Hilary Benn do a session with us for our conference online recently. That's how we are getting our messages to the decision makers as well as the policymakers. Next question, and I guess just 2 or 3 minutes before the next video. Based on the latest global assessment report, there is a new approach to provide a better understanding of disaster risk that takes into account the interlinkage of systems. What do I think about this systemic risk approach? Can we say that we have the first example of tangible system risk with the global risk COVID pandemic? By definition, risk is system. I've yet to find an example of non-system risk or non-systemic risk. So yes, the pandemic illustrates it, but so did the 1918 to 1920 influenza pandemic. So did the Black Death in the 14th century. So did the earthquake and flood examples, which I illustrated, because every single one of those was about long-term processes, about disaster never being a quick onset event, because disaster is not an event. When we're looking back in history, when we're looking across space, when we're trying to understand all these influences which create and maintain the vulnerabilities that cause disasters, it has to be systemic. It has to be system-based, and it always is. Risk and disaster, by definition, are long-term processes, long-term systems. And the final question, and then no, 2 more questions. So one, are all natural disasters induced by human activities? Well, again, disasters are not natural, so we shouldn't be using the phrase natural disaster. But yes, there are actually some exceptions of planet-wide hazards, which are almost impossible to address and almost impossible to reduce vulnerability. So if a supernova explodes near Earth, we're in trouble. Flood basalts, huge fissures ripping open the Earth and sending out lava which can cover the size of India up to several stories, if not several buildings high. That's hard. Ice ages induced by the Earth's orbital cycles. So there are many prospective hazards which have existed in geological time, fortunately have not existed while humanity has been around, which may be not very easy to deal with. And in a sense, they may be themselves natural disasters and really planet-wide cataclysms for which there's not a lot that we can do. And final question before going to the pandemic video, insurance companies always use the term natural disaster to escape from accountability. What steps should be taken in this case? Yeah, and insurance companies sometimes also use the phrase act of God, which again is exactly a way of trying to escape from accountability. So a lot of this may come with working with the reinsurance companies in that sector, and we do that. Part of it may have to come from legislation, so that goes back to the policymakers and the practitioners. And part of it is simply saying, well, sometimes legal vocabulary may be needed to differentiate. And as long as they identify and define, sometimes certain phrases may be useful. Personally, again, I'd rather remove that phrase natural disaster, but it will require a lot of work with the legal representatives, with the financial representatives. So let's do it. Let's sit down with them, let's work with them and see which company bites first and starts issuing policies which defines disaster according to the science without the phrase natural disaster. So I am seeing quite a lot of activity on Twitter, which may or may not be related to this. So I'm going to go to the second video on the pandemic and then come back and continue the discussion with your questions. So thank you again for all of these excellent questions. I am Ilan Kelman. I'm an academic staff member at University College London, 50% at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and 50% at the Institute for Global Health. The idea is to bring together disasters and health. And when we look at a worldwide disaster affecting almost everyone, it does turn out that it is a health disaster, a pandemic. So we are thinking now of the 2020 pandemic of COVID-19 from the coronavirus. Interesting that I said from the coronavirus rather than caused by the coronavirus. We know that disaster risk comes from hazard and vulnerability. We know that the virus is absolutely a hazard. But we also know that disasters are not caused by the hazard. So the pandemic, the disaster, what the world is experiencing in 2020 is not really from the virus, from the hazard, from coronavirus per se. It has to come from the vulnerability. So how do we explore a pandemic from the real causes of disasters, from the vulnerability approach? Well, we need to start with the basics. So absolutely, the virus exists. The virus, as far as we know at the moment, came from nature. But we know this happens. Microorganisms have been in nature and have affected humanity since we were a species. We have been through this before. We know that epidemics happen. We know that pandemics happen. We know that the microbes can be nasty and can do a lot of damage to us. So just like an earthquake, the hazard is there. Just like a flood, the hazard is there. So the virus is there, and it's up to us to look at the vulnerabilities and to be able to deal with it. But there may also become some aspects of hazard modification within this. So it's not just about letting the virus run rampant and seeing what happens. We know what that does because the Spanish flu pandemic around the end of the First World War killed, 50 million people, maybe up to 100 million people? And we don't want that to happen. So what does it mean about controlling the hazard? When it comes to the virus, we know, for example, that we have international systems of surveillance, of monitoring, and of response. Those have been cut back in recent years, and so they were not adequate to deal with the emerging threat once we knew it was available. So this isn't so much about the virulence of the microorganism, it's not so much about the transmissibility or infection rates or lethality. It's about the fact that we know this can happen. The systems for international response monitoring exist, and yet they have not been adequately funded, they have not been adequately resourced to stop this sort of pandemic that we see in 2020 from happening. It's not just the international level. Even at the national level, when the virus first apparently appeared in Wuhan, China, and the doctors were onto it right away, they reported and said, there's this really strange form of pneumonia. It could be an issue. We need to investigate it. And the response of the authorities was to silence the public health people, to intimidate them, to stop the doctors reporting and publicizing what they knew. So this is simply an issue of governance. Microbes emerge. They affect us. The public health practitioners, the health professionals see this and know what's going on, and they try to do something about it and to stop it, and were completely impeded with respect to those actions. So it didn't even have to become an epidemic, never mind a pandemic. But it was our choices, our decisions, the way we approach health governance, the way we approach disaster governance, which actually caused the pandemic, permitted that pandemic to happen. Even more fundamentally, when we look at countries being affected by it, and the fact that many of the health systems simply cannot cope. So again, we know epidemics and pandemics happen. We know coronaviruses happen. We've had them before, whether it was SARS or MERS. And yet we have not adequately resourced, built up, and staffed our health systems in order to ensure that we can deal with these situations. Some countries don't even have universal health coverage. So of course, when people get sick, they're not going to isolate. Of course, when people get sick, they might die when it's preventable because of our choices on how we deal with health. So the hazard is there. The virus is there. And we set up the conditions even to create that virus. So again, it's sort of thinking about, well, we can work with the international system, we can work with the national system, we can talk about health systems. But why did the virus emerge initially? And at the moment, the best information that we have, it was us encroaching into ecosystems. It was us dealing with animals in very unhygienic ways. And we know that ecosystem destruction, we know that interacting with animals unhygienically absolutely causes microbes to jump species. That's where SARS came from. That's where Ebola came from. That's where HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, came from. So again, we have the knowledge. The possibilities, the threats, the challenges with respect to microorganisms, jumping species, and investigating us, they were all known. We have the experience. We simply chose, we made the decisions not to act in order to prevent the hazard from becoming a disaster. And once that decision was made, once it was clear that the hazard was becoming a disaster, first an epidemic, then a pandemic, it really exposed all the vulnerabilities. It really showed the true causes of a disaster through our choices in terms of ensuring that all those vulnerabilities were still existing and were perpetuated. Again, this sort of goes back to some of the hazard aspects, showing that hazard and vulnerability are not independent. They do have interactions, they do push different characteristics of each other forward, and it can be very challenging conceptually to sometimes completely differentiate hazard and vulnerability. So I spoke about universal health coverage, and I said that our health systems are simply not adequate to deal with hazards. But that statement in itself is actually one fundamental vulnerability. So again, the hazard and the vulnerability overlap, and it's often sometimes challenging to actually say, well, we're drawing the line here, this is a separation. In fact, sometimes it's definitional, and it does lead to very important discussions, so feel free to raise these issues about why we even necessarily separate hazard and vulnerability, how we do so, and whether it is possible in all circumstances. But without the health systems, those who are marginalized already, those who don't have the resources to even get to a hospital or get to a doctor, never mind pay for that hospital treatment or pay for that doctor's advice, those are the people who tend to be worst hit by these health-related disasters. And that's simply the long-term chronic vulnerability which people experience. And so they're going to be exposed and damaged and harmed by any hazard, no matter what. This really shows how much comes back to these long-term chronic conditions. So if you don't have resources, if your livelihoods are not secure, if you're living in dilapidated buildings, if you don't have much option to own your own property or own land to take control of your own life in order to have much more fulfilling and lucrative livelihoods, no matter what the hazard, you're in trouble. And this is why the disaster is not an event. This is why the disaster is a long-term process. It's that long-term process of vulnerability coming from us, from our societal choices to create and maintain that vulnerability, which means that the disaster is not natural. So yes, some people are forced to encroach into ecosystems. Some people don't have much option, but for food and for livelihoods, they have to deal with wild animals, treat the animals very cruelly, and not very hygienically. So the hazard and vulnerability are completely intertwined, which sets up these long-term conditions that a species-jumping microbe is inevitably going to harm us and have the epidemic and pandemic potential. And again, this was all known. These conditions, these circumstances, these systems, we'd seen it before, some of the examples I mentioned, and we knew that it was going to happen again, yet we did so little to reduce the vulnerabilities We did so little to tackle the hazard. We did so little to say, if this does happen, what can we do to act swiftly and decisively in order to stop it? Even to the extent that the authorities in the Wuhan area tried to downplay many of the evident vulnerabilities. So they first tried to deny that there was human-to-human transmission of the new coronavirus. They first tried to say that they had it under control when the health professionals were saying otherwise. And then many countries internationally, some of them responded and said, this is a serious issue, let's deal with it. And there were some aspects of monitoring, of border controls, of trying to prepare health systems. Other countries just said, why bother? It's a hoax, or it's not really a big issue, or we can handle it. When they had the information that it was real and that they could not handle it and it was going to become a serious issue. So yes, a lot of people blame China. They call it the Chinese virus. And all the information that we have at the moment says, yes, it did originate in Wuhan. So that means that, yes, the authorities which behaved improperly absolutely deserve blame. But we also need to look to ourselves. Why did the international system not properly fund and support the international surveillance and monitoring? Why did the international system frequently try and prioritize spending money day to day, economy as measured through macroeconomic measures, rather than saying, hang on, there's a cost to health and safety, but look how much money we save and how many lives we save by implementing it? What sort of values create the misinformation and disinformation campaigns, which have actively inhibited many people from taking basic personal individual measures in order to stop the pandemic happening, and then when the pandemic was happening, trying to end it much more quickly. So it is interesting seeing how different countries responded. That places like Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea had learned from previous outbreaks and managed very quickly to get the virus in their country under control. There were certainly other increases, there were certainly other small outbreaks, but because of their experience and because of their dedication, they managed to do it. Whereas there are other countries, other leaders made the decision that they were going to first try and avoid lockdown, and then they weren't going to go into lockdown until really it was too late to stop tens of thousands of deaths and a really horrible amount of inconvenience. Because lockdown in itself, the response to the virus, the response to the pandemic, in itself is not neutral. It too causes many problems. And we have to recognize it irrespective of the probably hundreds of thousands of lives, if not more, which lockdown around the world has saved. It has also led to many deaths and many challenges. So we know that there are increased rates of domestic violence, suicide and self-harm, mental health issues and other stressors. If we had done it properly, if we'd been prepared, we could have very much done plenty to mitigate these challenges of lockdown and to save the lives which it has cost. Again, it's long-term vulnerabilities. Those without the choices, those without the options, they are the ones who suffer most. And when it comes down to it, if our choice is a horrendous and highly lethal pandemic compared to a horrendous and somewhat lethal lockdown, we've lost already. We have failed to address the vulnerabilities, we have failed to address the root causes of disasters, and we've failed to actually try and understand what we need for humanity and society to do better regarding health and safety across all hazards, particularly by tackling all vulnerabilities. So this really comes down to these root causes. To say the pandemic is a disaster, it absolutely emerged, was caused by the vulnerabilities, because we knew the hazard was there, we knew that the hazard could happen. So this is society making a choice, pandemic by choice, disaster by choice. But it's a fundamental question, whose choice? Most of us didn't have much option about the microbe emerging. Most of us didn't have much option about the international surveillance and monitoring systems. Most of us did not have much option or say in whether governments went into lockdown or not and the different types of lockdown. So this really illustrates how that small minority with power, options, resources, and control are making the decisions for the majority, creating the vulnerability which creates a disaster. Thank you. So thank you very much. And also, again, you will notice that there was a bit of an issue with the title, that this is not about conflict and disasters. This is about creating catastrophe, pandemics, and beyond. And we have had one excellent question come in, so I can address that immediately. And otherwise, please, in the chat or in the Q&A, put other questions you have. So as an example goes the question, geoscientists conduct analyses and are aware of hazard and vulnerability, but it seems policymakers do not want to take into account scientific findings. The worst disasters depend on what policy and decision makers do or do not do in practice. Can we as scientists do something more than we actually do? Absolutely. Become a policymaker. Stand for office. Get involved in campaigns. Now, I don't take that advice because I'm an academic and I intend to remain so. I think that I very much have a dream job. I enjoy what I'm doing in the way that I'm doing it. But I also recognize that my science and my words and actions do have to serve society. So that's where it sort of gets to the real root of the question. If we do want to be scientists, but still sort of say, well, can we as scientists do something more than we actually do? Well, I hope that this webinar assists. I hope that the tweeting, and again, there's some tweets coming in, but no questions on this. I hope that the tweets I do and other social media with my links there, I hope they contribute. I hope being in the classroom with our master students, with our undergraduate program in global humanitarian studies starting in September 2021, with the PhD students who I supervise, a couple of whom are on this call as if they haven't had enough of me already. I hope that by doing that, I am doing something more. So that, you know, certainly I want some of them to become academics, but others are going to be consultants, are going to be working with the government or government agencies, will be those policymakers, will go into industry or the nonprofit sector. So this is where, much as I want to sort of be on my own, just doing my science, writing up what I'm doing and pursuing my own interests, I have a duty and obligation to do things like this event for public engagement. I have a duty and obligation to supervise students, to work with them, to be in the classroom, to bring in guest lectures. So it's not just me sort of talking all the time. And by trying to get these ideas across, by trying to instill them, I hope that's what we're doing more. But, you know, don't hesitate to yourself. Look for programs which maybe place you in Parliament for 3, 6, or 12 months, which put you with a funding body for a short time. Or maybe you can become in the UK local councillor, which is often a part-time job. Maybe you even decide that you are going to stand for national or devolved parliament, or in other countries, provincial, state, territorial legislatures or assemblies, and become that policymaker, decision maker, bringing your science to that forum. Next question. Does the public have a role in creating vulnerabilities? It's always a balance. Individuals have some modicum of choice, resources, opportunities, power, some more than others. Often, we are also part of a collective. So it's peer pressure, or it's the norms, the rules, the legal aspects which we have to have as part of governance to be within society. So this means that the public individually and collectively do have a role to play. And it's always that balance between ensuring that we do maintain our role within society, but also maintain our individuality. And if everyone just said, well, I don't care about traffic lights and I don't care about formal education and I don't care about having to pay for groceries when I'm in the supermarket, well, that's going to be a problem. I mean, that's pure anarchy. On the other hand, if we all obey without question, then that means that we never get change, we never get challenges. So there's sort of two contrasting books out there, one called The Wisdom of Crowds, one called The Madness of Crowds. Again, it's sort of that balance between what collectives do. There's also the philosophical quotation that the truly loyal subject neither advises nor obeys unjust measures or complete obedience. So we can't challenge everything, but nor should we challenge nothing. And the role that we have is to be constructively critiquing, to point out the goods and the bads, to point out the advantages and disadvantages, to ensure that we are actually solving problems rather than creating them individually when we can and collectively in other points. Question come through on chat. You raised how decisions were influenced by the economic impacts. A lot of the actions in the UK, the timescale of the lockdown easing, all appear to favor the greatest contributor to GDP. Would you consider capitalism a vulnerability to human health? This is going to come down to definitions. There are advantages and limitations to any economic system. That includes but is not limited to capitalism. It may also depend on how capitalism is defined. If we take GDP, gross domestic product, as the one metric, absolutely yes. Relying on GDP is absolutely a vulnerability to human health and to human existence. On the other hand, it's going to be a balance between different modes of capitalism, which are much more equitable than the system that we see in the UK at the moment, while still leaving room for individual, for private entrepreneurship and innovation to pursue one's own interests constructively. In that case, we don't want to stymie people who are trying to do what they do best and actually support human health, support other aspects. We don't want to stymie their ability to pursue their own interests on their own and to be supported by the system. So yeah, it's, well, what do we mean by capitalism? How do we define it? We know that innovation and entrepreneurship are generally constructive and positive and need to be encouraged, in the same way that GDP and most other macroeconomic indicators tend to be overall destructive. So rather than simply saying, well, we need communism, which is, as bad as capitalism, or rather than just saying, well, all the fault is anti-fascist or all the fault is neoliberalism, saying, no, look, what good elements are there? What bad elements are there? How can we apply them constructively? And really, what is the problem? Rather than this overarching nebulous word like capitalism, something much more tangible like GDP, which is a problem. And I'll take one more question and then close this session formally, but I'm happy to stay on and continue discussing if people want to continue putting comments, but then we will start the formal session after this. So what can the world's decision makers do to avoid the underreporting and suppression of scientific researchers by government? Well, similar, as a scientist, become a decision maker. Talk to people. Again, do webinars, be on Twitter, be on social media, in order to very constructively, calmly, and positively support the role of science. Come and do our degrees, whether it's another undergraduate degree or a first undergraduate degree, another master's or your first master's, another PhD or your first PhD, in order to recognize how much we interact with the people in London and around the world, in all the sectors, international organizations, governments, industry, and the nonprofit, in order to exactly point out the value of science, of evidence, and of discussion. Because science is not the end story. It is an essential input. We must use it, and I absolutely agree that we need much more of it. But we also need to put it in the context of other possible policy and decision-making factors. And that's where, again, rather than hurling nasty insults, rather than fighting each other and battling, how can we disagree and diverge without the hate? How can we disagree and diverge while being constructive? How can we acknowledge and accept our differences and in them find strengths? That often is the fundamental challenge. It's what we try to bring to our research, to our education, and our public engagement. And it's really up to you to make that judgment whether we succeed. So thank you again so much for joining us. Again, obviously some people have to go, but otherwise, if you're going to put more comments in the chat or in the question and answer, I'm happy to continue talking and replying to them. Nothing new's come up, so I may go back to some of the other ones, and I'm just going to do a quick peek on Twitter because I've seen some things come through to see if there's any comments or questions regarding that on Twitter. So at the moment, it looks like just a lot of likes and a lot of reactions, but no specific questions. So that's fine. I mean, one element, and actually one of the Twitter threads which has been going on today is about history. and what we can and should learn from history. Unfortunately, so much of what people think about invulnerability is saying, well, let's take a snapshot in space and time. Let's calculate it according to these very bounded parameters. And that, by definition, is not vulnerability. It's interesting when you look at a lot of the climate change work and a lot of how they look at vulnerability, they're bounding it, they're calculating it. They're seeing it as almost not quite, but almost universal and objective, which of course is the antithesis of what the story of vulnerability is. Whereas disaster work, development work, all these wonderful questions on policy and decision makers really need to try and show how vulnerability is created over a long time period. It's about us, where we're coming from, where we are in the present, and where we're going in the future, and why disaster is this long-term process, not an event, not something which happens quickly, but something which is built up over the long term. So if we do want to try and get these messages to the media, to these policymakers, to the decision makers, it's really thinking long-term, bringing in history, bringing in what we know, and also admitting what we don't know in order to try and do much better. Some of these ethoses are not necessarily easy to convey. Again, it's fine being on Twitter, but that's only 280 characters. Well, it's amazing how many insults you can actually get into 280 characters. So maybe we should use our talents to try and be more constructive in terms of using these media. But it's not just about Twitter. Again, there's the other social media, there's events like this, drop me an email, and I'm happy to respond to try and say fundamentally, what do we mean? Why do we drop exposure, or why should we drop exposure? Why is all risk systemic? And why is vulnerability this long-term process? And it's good that we are now having some other questions come in. So in an international humanitarian aid setting, during a global pandemic, how would an NGO correctly go about quantifying the vulnerability that would be created by suspending aid programs versus the vulnerability created by maintaining the programs and risk increasing infection rates? The fact we have to ask that question means we've lost. You've articulated it so well, in fact, so terrifyingly well. When that's our choice, we are in deep, deep trouble. So I will simply go to me joining disasters in health by saying that the fundament in both is prevention is better than cure. So why don't we do it? Because unfortunately, we are in the situation where your question is frighteningly meaningful and it is operational, it has to be made. So how do you do it? Unfortunately, it means that we're going to end up in a situation that many doctors and hospitals ended up, where they were simply deciding who are they going to kill. And many doctors and other health care practitioners have actually committed suicide, because doing this for days, weeks on ends was just unacceptable to them. That's not why they got in the field. Even in the UK, over 300 health and care workers have died from coronavirus. The total should be 0. We cannot even provide our basic lifesavers with the protective equipment which they need to save our lives. So when we're in that situation, this is long-term vulnerability. This is a disaster. So yeah, what do I advise you as an NGO? I just say you have to make artificial assumptions, make the calculation, and ultimately make an ideological, strategic, or policy choice about who's going to live and who's going to die. And the fact that we and the healthcare workers are in the situation where we are asking these questions and those are our choices, that is the disaster. So I think that covers the chat, and we have another question in the Q&A. Oh yes, I think I did respond to that actually. This is about GDP and would I consider capitalism a vulnerability to human health? So yes, I did address that. So I think that actually that may cover it. So yeah, I'll check Twitter again, but I'm happy to just hang around here. I'll be online but not talking. So if you do come up with questions, then please just throw them into either the chat or the Q&A. I'll now browse Twitter And just to say thank you so much again for joining. Again, my social media contacts are there. This will be going on YouTube, and you'll find that if you go onto the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction YouTube channel, there are many other videos. If you search for my name, you'll also see many other videos of me, and drop me a line. Let me know what you might need, and hoping to also see some of you at UCL, either in the classroom or in our public events. So thanks so much again. And again, you'll see me here if anything comes up. But otherwise, I'm just going to check Twitter and see if there's anyone commenting on there. Thank you again for joining us.